Hello and welcome to Breaking the Guard. I have just returned from my trip in Japan. I was there for 15 days and I got to see a lot of that country going from Tokyo to Nikko, Nagano, Kanazawa, Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe, and then finally Okinawa. And we doing a return trip to Tokyo. So quite hectic. I think I put a little too many cities in that time span because we're basically spending about 2 to 3 days per place. But it was the best way to try to see as much as we possibly could over there. Now, what I found very interesting, I've never been to Japan before, uh, culturally very different than the US, and many things that are very familiar to me from my martial arts background. One, the people there have so much pride in their work, and it shows in any position. I would go, for example, to a 7-Eleven to get water, and then I had my dessert treat there was ice cream, which I would get Haagen-Dazs because I know Haagen-Dazs is actually made like real ice cream, egg yolks, milk, cream, and they use sugar, which is not honey, but it's close enough for a vacation snack. And I would go just to get a little thing of ice cream for myself. The attendant would run over, grab a spoon, get a napkin, and would hand it to me so that I could enjoy the ice cream without, trying to find a spoon or anything like that. And that little gesture was repeated at every 7-Eleven across the country. Uh, and, that's just one simple example, but it goes from restaurant servers to, train operators, taxis. We had a taxi, I remember that we didn't have an umbrella and it was raining, but we got onto a taxi. And on the way out, the attendant told us to wait in the car. And they ran to their trunk, grabbed an umbrella, and gave it to us. And I was like, what the hell, That's amazing. Like, that's a very nice gesture. Now, it turns out these umbrellas, they're like city umbrellas, I guess, and people kind of give them out, I suppose. Because I know we essentially gave it to somebody else later down the road. Nevertheless, just an amazing gesture. And it shows a genuine care for their customers and their fellow people. So I found that, really amazing. It's something you rarely see, at least in my life in the US, that seems to be the norm in Japan. The other thing that kind of goes along with it is that everyone in Japan has a uniform. When you go to the 7-Eleven, everybody's dressed the same way. When you go to the zoo, all the staff are dressed based on their position. Um, the taxis generally all have white gloves. They wear, like, if it's a chauffeur service, they all have their little white gloves and suits. Uh, and yet we would go to these cafes, which they call them cafes, but it's really just like an animal house where you have like owls or, chipmunks or whatever animal that they are showcasing, but all of them are dressed in the same uniform, right? So again, you can kind of see right now where I'm going with this, as far as like the parallels to martial arts, right? But it shows a sense of order and discipline that they're all dressed accordingly. And it does really make a difference as far as my perception of the business versus everybody just wearing whatever they wanted to. Uh, so I found that interesting. They, uh, the city of Tokyo, from my understanding, has 38 million people. So it's a very big city, on the level of like a New York City. And there was not one piece of trash I saw on the floor, no graffiti, no homeless. And you would see small children, I'm talking about grade school, 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, roaming the street by the city by themselves, not with an adult. And that was normal. And I bring that point up because it is so safe that they trust their kids to be able to navigate on their own. They're going to school on their own. They're coming back from school on their own. They're going, to meet up with friends or going to eat. They're navigating subway systems and metros on their own. That type of autonomy is in the U.S. would be considered like child neglect, and over in Japan, that's standard. So another thing that's amazing to be able to feel so safe in your society that you could trust your kids to be on their own and they'd be fine. And that kind of reminds me of what it was like when I was growing up in late 80s, early 90s, where we would just go out and just explore and come back home before dark. Our parents, we didn't have cell phones. We were just able to, just explore the world with our friends and, sometimes get into trouble, sometimes not get into trouble, right? But like we were trusted, and I guess the society was trusted enough to know that it wasn't that dangerous where we could get into potential trouble that we couldn't navigate out of. And I think that has diminished over time. So it was interesting to see it overseas that existed. And I guess a level of safety that I haven't experienced in my life, like how comfortable it was. There was no sketchy places that I was in Japan. And, when you go into subways in New York City, it doesn't feel great, right? It's kind of like going into a public bathroom. You don't know what you're going to get. It usually kind of smells, and there might be some undesirable element you want to avoid being in. You're just there to do the job, right? And get out of there. Conversely, in Japan, the metros are very clean. They're pleasant. They're comfortable to be seated in. Mind you, it does get busy at certain times, and you will be like squished together. But even then, it's not horrible, right? So it's another thing that struck me there. Particularly, another thing that also got my attention was they married architecture with landscaping quite well. You would see lots of skyscrapers and whatnot, but they would have floors where it's just all trees and bushes and greenery. And even along the highways, they would have vines on the walls. They tried to marry the landscape with the buildings, so it doesn't look like a concrete jungle, right? Like there's actual vegetation and trees all over the place. So very thoughtfully designed. And these are some of the things that stuck out to me. And obviously, one of the big ones is just the respect. Uh, Anyone who's working with you, or whether it's a taxi, your concierge, or the hotel clerk, they're bowing to you. They're saying thank you. They're welcoming you, and they're always paying respect to their customers. And I found that very refreshing. They definitely have an approach of humility to how they do service. And I started with a level of pride in their work, and as in no one's just clocking in the 9 to 5 and just wanting to get the hell out of there. It seems that everybody's kind of going out of their way to do their best level of service possible. And mind you, this is a culture which tipping is not allowed. It's, from my understanding, is somewhat insulting to try to give somebody a tip. And we're led to believe here in the States that, without tipping, people are not going to work that extra mile. Like you have to reward them for that extra effort. Whereas in Japan, they don't even have that incentive, and they go well above that, and do so without appearing to be coerced, right? Like they just genuinely want to know that they did their best. And I think that is probably the best mind space or headset that you would want to have for your employees or your staff or people that are going to be working with you. Not that they need to be financially motivated to do, extra, that they just take pride in their work. They want to know that I made this or I'm doing this. So I want people to know that it's the best that I have to offer. So at least I feel that's what I try to do when I'm teaching, when I'm, working on my app or whatnot. Like I'm trying to showcase the best that I have because I enjoy what I do. So I want to make sure that others enjoy the fruits of my labor and are able to benefit from it. So to me, I found that part of Japan very interesting and invigorating. Now, as far as the sites and tourism, we did have a good amount of sightseeing. We saw lots of temples and churches, did some hiking, a good amount of animal encounters that we got in there. All that was fun. They do have some access to things that we normally wouldn't be able to do. Like we were in a place that had like 40 different owls, and they get to perch on your shoulders, and you can, interact with them all sorts of ways. My wife loves playing with animals, so we got to do a lot of that with like meerkats and ferrets, hedgehogs, miniature pigs, sea otters, all sorts of little critters. So that was cool. Um, the temples and they had a lot of Buddhist stuff, which I wasn't expecting. I knew, like, from my understanding, Shinto was the religion there, but a lot of the temples were Buddhist temples, and so you're seeing a lot of stuff that I didn't expect to see in Japan, and that was interesting. Seeing some of the samurai and ninja stuff was really cool. They had some exhibits where you would do tours and see like the different eras of the Edo period and how the samurai played a role in their caste system. We got to eat at a restaurant that was descended from a samurai, and they had the samurai armor on display, and that was interesting. Other things I enjoyed trying the Japanese Wagyu in Japan. Also, Kobe. We went to Kobe, which is, I didn't know it was a city, but in Kobe we had Kobe beef at like the top restaurant there, and one of the top restaurants there at least, and it was excellent. Definitely a level above as far as flavor profile and richness, unique to anything I've ever tried. The Wagyu was very marbled, rich. I put pictures of it on my Instagram and whatnot if you were following it. So American Wagyu is not anywhere the same as Japanese Wagyu. I think they're two very different creatures, and literally different creatures, because the ones in Japan, obviously Japan, American. So like they brought that same breed of cow, but they're raising it in the U.S. I'm not sure the standards are the same. Seeing how meticulous they are about certain things, I imagine the level of care they put is significantly higher. And for example, at least from my experience there, which is limited, but I was there for like 2 weeks and we were dining out every day. What we consider a steakhouse in Japan is, in the U.S. is very different than how it works in Japan from what I've seen. And most of the steakhouses I saw were teppanyaki style, which would basically be like benihana, right? Where you have the big skillet and the chef's cooking the food in front of you. But in the US, we associate that with a show, right? Like you have the chef, he'll make the volcano of the onion rings, and then he'll, spin the eggs, crack it in the air, throw food at your face, right? That type of stuff. And the setup is very different as far as they have the table that's kind of like a U, the chef's in the middle, and then he has, all the customers around the table. That is not the setup in Japan. The setup in Japan is usually like a sushi bar, right? So it's like a bar, and the chef's just behind, and it's kind of like a straight counter where he's doing all the cooking in front of you, and there's no show. He's not making onion ring volcanoes or throwing food at you. He's just cooking it in front of you. So it's a lot less theatrical, right? They're just keeping it simple, cooking the food in front of you. They seem to take a lot more care uh, on doing certain things. Like it looked like one of the big things was to make garlic chips, where they would slice these little um, garlic cloves into very, very thin slices and then fry it over oil, which they would then save the oil to cook the steaks in. So it was like a garlic infused oil. And I went to maybe I would say like three levels of steakhouses, if you will. One would be like very casual, where the chips were made in advance and the guy just had them in a container and he would just pour it on your thing, right, on your plate. The second one, I saw a guy who, he actually sliced the garlic, he fried the chips, used the oil, and cooked it in front of you. He wasn't too meticulous about it, he just did it like he was cooking it at home. The third one, which is the high-end restaurant in Kobe, the guy was very careful on how he cut the garlic, and he laid each garlic individually on a slice on the pan, and took him about like 10 minutes to cook this, where the other chef did it like in 2. And he would turn each thing individually to make sure each side was cooked perfectly. Obviously, that one was the best one. Uh, but the level of detail that they put into like a small, trivial, almost trivial side item was impressive, right? Uh, and of course, that one we had, what they called. So Kobe beef is basically Wagyu, but made with stricter guidelines, right? So visually, they can appear very similar, right? And I had an A5 Wagyu, not full-bodied fat. There's like I had what I think it's called premium level. There's a level above that, but I didn't care to try that one because that one's pretty much almost a block of fat. And I've had that before, or an equivalent of that in the US, and interesting, but not my cup of tea, right? So I wanted something that was a little bit more of a steak eating experience, which this Kobe was. It was very, obviously very marbled, but still had protein in it, so you can enjoy the steak, So I had that compared to just a traditional Wagyu, because my wife had a traditional Wagyu, I had the Kobe, and we shared them, and you could tell the difference in the flavor. The Kobe had a significant, like, I guess we call it umami, another texture, or not texture, but another taste to it that was lacking in the Wagyu. Not an everyday meal for sure, but definitely a luxury treat that I'm glad I was able to enjoy there. And as a country, obviously, it's very friendly towards carnivore diets because everything has meat in it. And but so I ate lots of different Wagyus from all the different regions, because they'll have Wagyu from Hokkaido, hot Wagyu from Nagano, all the different districts had their own Wagyus, So that was a lot of fun eating there, and again, delicious. So a good culinary experience as well. I think the only thing that I didn't find as interesting, honestly, were the temples. We probably went to the best place for the temples in the beginning, which was Nikko. It's kind of not a big city, somewhat remote, located in the northern, not the most northern part, but north of Tokyo. We had some nice hikes there also. But a lot of temples are very similar. So, and I guess since I don't speak the language, I don't read the language, I probably lose a lot of the significance of the monuments and not being able to understand the context of it. Uh, but they kind of blend in together a bit. So after seeing like 10 or 12 temples in Nikko, and we go to other places, they all kind of had the same structure, not surprisingly. So, uh, but seeing the samurai and ninja stuff was really cool. I enjoyed that quite a bit. The islands also were colder than advertised. We went to Okinawa, which is, again, an island on the southeast, or I guess more south, rather. And online, it kept saying it was 81 degrees temperature water. Man, it was not 81 degree temperature water. It was probably like, I imagine, low 70s, because it was pretty chilly. Not cold enough, or I mean, warm enough where you could stay in there without a wetsuit and, swim around, but it wasn't that nice warm water that I'm used to in Florida. So a little disappointing there. They also seem to close down a lot of their beaches in the winter, uh, and with no clear reason why. Because we wanted to do some snorkeling. We got to do some of it, but we went to one area where they said the snorkeling was great, and everyone was saying the beaches were closed, and it wasn't a jellyfish season or anything like that. So I'm not sure what the deal was. So that was a little bit of a bummer. But other than that, nice trip. Um, and I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to go and check out Japan. I definitely uh, took away some things culturally from how customer service can be raised up a significant level just by being mindful of and having the right mindset, and it doesn't cost anything. It's just putting effort. Anyhow, that was my take on it. I did get back on the 7th, and on the 8th, I was fortunate enough to be able to see the final of the PGF Worlds Season 7. And I only followed a little bit. I saw day one, but obviously I was in Japan. I wasn't tuned in entirely. But on the finals, and I'm just going to refresh my memory just a little bit here. You had Ryan Aitken, Nathan Haddad, Paul Aderla, Elijah Carlton, Marcin Macilewicz, Davis Asare, Chris Wojak, and Ernesto Rivera. So a lot of familiar names there. And overall, good action on this. There was, I believe, 4, 5, 6 submissions out of, would have been 10 matches. So that's pretty good. 60% finish ratio. The matches that did go into OT were pretty intense, and it wasn't like one guy just ran away with it. So it was exciting matchups. Spoiler alerts coming through here. Opening round. And mind you, if you're not familiar with the PGF format, they do 4 days it's 5 days in a row. So in the fifth day in the finals, you have just completed 8 matches previously. It's grueling schedule. And these were bigger boys, 205 pounders. So recovery is going to be a bit worse for these guys than the lightweights. And I feel like it definitely showed, especially as the tournament wore on. The first matches, like Ryan Aitken defeated Nathan Haddad soundly, got top position, pressure past him, went into the mount, set up an arm triangle, got the finish, looked very clean technically there, and this great performance by him. An odd thing they were doing this time around, they would give a warning to somebody who was being passive, and then they would give a shot clock where I guess it was like 15 seconds where they had to do something significant, or they would be started from bottom turtle. And the crazy thing about this was that Ryan had just mounted Nathan and had an arm triangle being set up. He already had the arm crossed over, head down in the butcher's block in 10th planet terms, and was getting ready to shift to the side. But they had called a shot clock on Nathan Haddad from being bottom out and not doing anything. And then the ref was trying to stop the match to reset in the bottom turtle. And Ryan's like, no. I'm about to win here. Like, don't move my position, you know. And they allowed it to continue, fortunately, and then he did get the finish. It just seemed like a really silly ref call. Like, why would you stop this? And they had other situations that this occurred that I felt were poorly timed or poorly executed, where they would have a person who is stuck in a front headlock on bottom, and they would call the bottom person for passivity. And I think it was actually in one of the super fights or whatnot. It was what's her name? They don't have the name here. Oh yeah, Vanessa Demopoulos. She was going against like Kaya Jackson, and Kaya got her in a guillotine. So she pulled guard, ended up getting passed. So it was bottom side control with a full front headlock and very solid grip. So the choke was still a threat. And they called passivity on Vanessa being on bottom. Now, there's no good, it's not good to try to sit up in this position or to turn because you're going to get choked. So it's usually better to try to stay on your back there, and you're not going to get guillotined right away, and you can kind of fight the grip there. But I think Vanessa, with her inexperience in the rule set, reacted to the shot clock and turned into her, immediately got guillotined, high elbowed, and finished. You know, so the passivity worked against her there because like she should have not moved. The smart thing to do was to stay put. And it seemed like a lot of these passivity calls were being called mostly on top guys, although in those two situations that were, again, I felt poorly timed, they were called in the bottom guy. But a lot of times it would be the guy trying to pass someone's, supine guard or seated guard, and the top guy just wasn't engaging a lot, but neither was the bottom guy. It felt kind of mutual, right? Where you had, in one case, a guy just controlling grips from the bottom, not really advancing, and they would always call it passivity on the top guy. So I appreciate the idea of that stalling claw and giving them the shot clock. I think is a great add as far as not just immediately penalizing them, but giving them a chance to work out, which always seemed to motivate people. But I felt it was a little bit biased towards to be against the top guy. In my take, anyways. Anyhow, so Ryan won the first match against Nathan Dad by submission. You had Paul Dirla. He defeated Elijah Carlton by knee bar. This is actually when Elijah probably wished he didn't get the stalling call because it was Ardilla that got the stalling call from working on top. They started Ardilla on bottom. Elijah tried to chase the back and throw the hooks in on the restart, and Paul was able to get that knee bar from the back mount and get a quick tap. So that worked in his favor, actually. Then Marcin defeated David Cesare by straight ankle lock. And again, there was actually two straight ankle locks back-to-back because Chris Wojak also got a straight ankle lock victory against Ernesto Rivera. So, and it's funny because Brandon thought they were both Aoki locks. So no, they were just two classic straight ankle locks, right? It looked like Asare had an ankle injury previously because he was all taped up. And I saw in one of the highlights, he did get ankle locked pretty bad. I think it was actually by Marcin as well. So probably didn't feel good to get stuck in there again. In the semifinals, this is where I felt you could really see people's fatigue set in. Particularly with Ryan Aiken versus Paul Ardilla. They were both really tired, probably about 5 minutes into that match. And you could tell Paul was having a really hard time moving. Ryan was fatigued, but he looked a little fresher. And in the overtimes, they had a good back and forth. Ryan, of course, has great back control, but I felt he was too tired to get a finish. Like his grips were probably toast. So he wasn't as much of a choking threat, although he had a couple good bites which had potential, but I think he was more in it for the riding time at that point, which was a smart strategic call. He's got great back control, and Paul was just surviving to his go. And there was one moment, I think, Paul had a really good run where he went, I think it was in the second overtime, because they were doing EBI, sudden death, but only starting from the back mount. So no spiderweb starts. And Paul was able to go into an armbar setup, had a really good bite, arm fully extended, but Ryan was able to turn out and escape. And I think he blew his wad on that on that attempt, because when they were getting ready to start the third round, he was just lying flat there, and Eddie Bravo had to push him up into the seated position so that Ryan could get into position. He was so tired. Uh, but he ended up losing by riding time. Ryan had dominated. He had held full 6 minutes. Basically, it was a 2 minute time limit, and he held the full 2 minutes each round. Paul had no way of escaping. I think he was just too tired, and he was just he wasn't going to try to win by riding time. He was going to try to win by submission, and it didn't happen for him. And Chris Wojak with Marcin, similar. Well, they had more submission attacks. They were both trying to ankle lock each other. It looked like Marcin had more attempts, but Chris had the better bites. But neither of them, I think, got really close to finishing. They went into overtime, and this overtime was very close. I think it was probably less than 10 seconds between them in riding time. But Chris edged out Marcin, and they looked both a bit fresher. None of them were collapsed between matches, but they were definitely breathing heavy. And then in the finals, you had Ryan Aitken versus Chris Wojak. Um, Again, some leg lock battling, not as much as with Marcin. They traded turns being top and bottom. Ryan, well, I would say Chris looked better when he was on top, just like Ryan looked better when he was on top. And I think if Chris would have pushed the pace more and tried to force being top more, he could have done better work at fatiguing Ryan and maybe even getting a finish. But he seemed content trying to play the bottom game, going for leg locks. And I felt that gave Ryan the rest he needed to kind of recover and not expend as much energy. Because Ryan was definitely looked like he had more wear in him than Chris, but he was playing a smarter game. And in the overtime, this is the part where I knew that Ryan would do better at, because he's great at back riding. Chris, not as much. And it showed because Ryan was able to ride Chris usually for like a minute and a half. And this is to a credit to Chris, because he was able to escape each round, and he got faster in his escapes in each consequent round, which was impressive. He had to turn quite a bit. He did eat some strong chokes and neck cranks along the way, but Chris's control wasn't there. Like Ryan was able to get out within 10 seconds in a couple rounds. So it was clear that Chris had to go for a submission, and the chokes wasn't going to be it. He wasn't able to get a good seatbelt. I don't know if it was the size differential. Chris was definitely smaller. He was small for that division. Ryan, upper body wise, was significantly larger. So maybe he wasn't able to get around well. But his back control wasn't there. And I felt like the strategy would have been to try to shift into an armbar, go from a seatbelt to a Kimura grip, throw the armbar, because the choke was never really getting there. And the back control wasn't there. Or maybe try to go, instead of back mount truck ride, twister control type of deal. And I say this as someone who also suffers, like I really have a hard time getting a body triangle. My legs are just not long enough. I have short femurs, so like I don't really get around that well. So riding back mount with both hooks is usually trickier for me. I usually like riding one leg and going into, truck positions, where I feel I can definitely control people a lot longer when I get them on the leg side, single leg riding. But in any case, Ryan ended up winning that. Again, all credit to him. What a great someone had made this point before, and I felt the sentiment that doing what would have been 11 matches in 5 days at 205 pounds is difficult, right? That's very grindy work. So to come out on top in this and the way he did, what a gauntlet for a guy like Ryan. And not only did he win his 20K for winning the finals, but his team also won the regular season, so he also won another 20K on top of that. So big payday for him. 40K in grappling is no joke. So congratulations to him on a very well played game. I think a fresh Ryan has a much better run at a fresh Chris, and I think there is a size advantage as well. But it just goes to show his ability to play strategically and smart, even when you know you're somewhat impaired, right? Because at least in my mind, I could see even the difference from match 1 to match 2. Like, it's a very different guy coming out now because like the fatigue has set in quite a bit. His first match, like I said, looked technically very sharp, and he was able to execute a finish pretty cleanly. And by the end of match 2, it was like now we're in a battle of attrition mode, right? It's like who's going to expend the most energy, who's going to play the smartest, and he did a really good job at that. And congrats to Brandon McCarron for running another great tournament here. The PGF is definitely picking up, and I hope it continues to do so. I see the athletes are getting paid well, getting good exposure. Now they're in UFC Fight Pass. So I think they did the regular days on YouTube, which you can still catch them on there. And these are long streams, by the way. It's like 8 hours. I watched one of them on like triple speed, just so I could try to get through it kind of quickly to get caught up. But there's a lot of grappling to be watched there. So anybody who's trying to study some high-level grappling, a lot of leg locks going on. Particularly if you watch day 1, you'll see some stuff that I've shown recently, like kneeling ankle locks type of deal with straight ankle locks. Quite a bit of straight ankle locking going on, and a lot more ashi here than 50-50. At least that I saw. I didn't see day 2, 3, or 4, but I watched day 1, and there was a lot of ashi attacking, and some Z locks in game over positions. So I'll do some breakdowns as well over the channel over the next couple of weeks. But great stuff, and again, the more venues that athletes have to be able to perform and make a living off of, the better. So kudos to Brandon as well for making this happen. I'm glad to see that the league is growing. And that's all I have for this week. Well, I actually mentioned one last thing that I just saw, which was Jon Jones commented on, I think I covered this in a previous podcast about him, or the UFC rather, snubbing Tom Aspinall for this title unification. And Jon Jones chipped in and said that he has no interest in fighting Tom Aspinall because he hasn't proven himself yet. He hasn't done anything, right? And he's either going to retire or he's going to fight Alex Pereira. Now, I understand that he is, older, and I'm not sure if an Aspinall fight is a big money fight, whereas an Alex Pereira fight for sure is a big money fight. But to say that Aspinall hasn't done anything is insulting. He has knocked out just about everybody in the top of the heavyweight division. And I think if you see the top 10, he's cleared out like 6 or 7 of them. The only guys he hasn't faced, I think, is Miocic, and there's 2 others. And they're like below the top 5, I believe. So he's done what he has to do as a heavyweight contender, and has looked marvelous doing so. So to say he's done nothing is BS. Like, he has. Now, has he been tested to the degree that Jon Jones has? No, right? I don't think he's had the level of opposition available for him to, because we've had people move away, right? Like, he could have fought a Francis Ngannou, but Francis left the division, and I felt under a good reason, but it still took away that big fight, and Tom Aspinall wasn't around to be able to fight a DC, so he's fought the best the UFC has to offer. So the other thing is, if you're the champ, to me, it's kind of compulsory to you to unify the belt if you have an interim belt standing around. And to say he's done nothing, no, he has an interim belt. That's technically your belt until, like, the belt is under contention. So he's not the uncontested heavyweight champion right now. It's the contested heavyweight champion. I feel to say that, I felt that was insulting to say Tom Aspinall hasn't done anything. So yes, he has. And it's now, I think in a normal league, it would be like forced that he either fight to unify the belt or he vacate the belt, right? Because that's the whole point of the interim belt. It's unfair to that interim champ to not have it unified, especially when the champion is around and fighting other fights and now planning another fight. Like, it's kind of like he evaded him once and then he's going to evade him twice. I don't understand how that works. And it's hard to say that he's not ducking him. And mind you, I think Jon Jones is probably the greatest of all time. I'm not his biggest fan outside the cage. I think his antics and the trouble he's gotten into has tarnished his legacy quite a bit. But as far as his ability to fight, his desire and will, and his technical strategy, he's the best, man. Like, the guy is great everywhere. He's able to beat people and make it look easy. He can beat people at their own games, So he is, like I said, probably the greatest of all time in fighting. But he's ducking Tom Aspinall. That's my opinion. I don't think he wants that fight. I think it's not a good business maneuver for him because the risk is high and the payoff is low. Because he beats Tom Aspinall, everybody's going to be, well, he was supposed to beat Tom Aspinall. And I don't think Tom is as big of a draw as Poatan right now. Poatan's just on fire. And I think Potan's less of a risk, honestly. Striking, sure, he's dangerous. But Jon Jones is, if he's smart, he's not going to strike with Poatan. He's going to take him down and finish him on the ground. And I think he's going to make it look easy. So I think less of a risk, bigger payoff, and even if he did lose, it wouldn't be like, oh, you ruined your legacy. It's like, well, you lost to a guy on the end of your career who's at the top of his career right now and who's widely regarded as the most dangerous striker. So I think that's the calculus going into this. So it is a duck. Now, is it a duck because he's afraid of this fight, or he just, between the two choices, he'd rather take the choice that pays more and less risk? And I get that. He's older, he's got to think about his future and stuff like that. But to say that he's not ducking this guy seems, it's very hard for me to not think that, And especially if he's going to retire after he fights Poatan potentially, it definitely seems like a major duck. Like, you have a responsibility as a champion to unify your belt, and you're kind of avoiding that responsibility because you're going to clock yourself out. So I don't know how not to think it's not ducking. And I don't like to think that because, like I said, I think he is one of the greatest of all time, despite his muddied record. But, it is what it is. Anyhow, that's all I have for you guys. I'll let you all go now. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you next week.